In this tutorial, we're going to look at a couple more principles that are quite key to building successful rigs. We're going to build a simple piston, and to follow along in this tutorial, you need to open the SimplePiston start file. When you open it up, you should see something similar to this. So we've got the scene basically set up with everything in position, but all of the objects, as you can see, are in the object manager. So what we need to do is work out how we can arrange this hierarchy, and what we're also going to do is we're going to work with a few constraints to make a simple piston rig. So the way that it should work is that the camshaft here rotates, which rotates this cam wheel. This rod is attached to this, moves up and down. As it moves up and down, as the wheel rotates, it pulls the piston head up and down within this chamber. The first thing to do is to sort out the hierarchy so that the objects, the child to parent relationship, makes sense. So for instance, we start with our camshaft, and then we need to make our cam wheel a child of this. And that means that if we rotate our camshaft, then our cam wheel is also going to rotate. This rod here needs to be attached to this cam wheel, but we need to think about where the axis for these objects is. Basically, this is a primitive, so the axis is currently in the middle, but really if you think about it, we need the axis to be up at this point, because as this rotates around, we want this to follow along, but we need it to continually point down. So if we take the rod and we put that inside the cam wheel now, of course, when we rotate the camshaft, it's all going to come along for the ride. Let's just undo that. Now the rod object is a primitive, so we could make this editable and we could move the axes up to here, but sometimes that isn't always an option. So what we can do instead is just hold down the Alt key and add in a null object, which will make that rod a child. And what it automatically does is places that null at the same position as the axes of the selected object. Call this null rod axis. And then what we need to do is move this up to the point here, and we can do that by switching to axis mode, and we can grab this and then pull this up to this point here. So now if we actually rotate the rod axis, then the rod itself is going to rotate. So next thing we want to do is to make sure that this always points down, and we can do that by using, for instance, a target tag, which you may be familiar with, but what we're going to do is we're going to do it with a constraint, because it's a lot more flexible in how you set this up. So with the rod axis selected, come to tags and choose character tags, and let's add in a constraint. And a constraint allows you to constrain very many things, but in this example what we're going to do is we're going to use the aim constraint. So check the aim constraint and then select the aim tag. In the aim constraint, you can see that we have a target that we need to choose and drop it into this field here. And this is the object that the rod axis is going to basically point towards. We need to determine which axis we want to point towards our target. So we need to target something that's down here at the bottom. And if you look at the axis of our rod axis now, you can see that Y is pointing up. So what we want to do is we want to set this to negative Y. So in other words, we're going to be pointing down the rod. We then need to create a target for it. Now we could use one of our existing objects, but these are going to be moving up and down, or the chamber, for instance, won't be moving, but the axes of that object might not be in the right place. So the easiest thing here is just to add in another null, and let's call this the base. And I'm going to grab this and pull this down to the bottom here, so it's around the bottom of our chamber, somewhere around here. Select the constraint tag again. Let's drag this base into the target. Now you shouldn't notice any difference, but you can see it has actually jumped. So let me just come to my side view. You can see that my base is still right back here. So I need this to be in the middle of our chamber. I'm just going to set that just by eye. Okay, and now we have that pointing there. If we grab our camshaft, and now if we rotate, you can see that what's happening is we've got the first part of that set up. So as we rotate around, that rod is always pointing downwards. So let's set that back to 0. Jumping back to the front view, the next thing is we've got this piston head, and we want this to be moving up and down as the rod moves up and down. So in other words, we want this piston to be connected to the end of our rod. Let's just hide that chamber for a moment. So we can do that using another constraint. So let's just right click, choose character tags, and constraint is just chopped off the top there. And we're going to use a PSR constraint this time. That means position, scale, rotation. Let's enable that and switch to the tab. Now we only really want to constrain the position because we want the position of our piston to be constrained to the tip of our rod. So we can uncheck rotation. The other thing as well is if we open up the constrain parameters here, we only actually want to constrain the position Y, so we can uncheck position X and uncheck position Z. So now, in other words, the only thing we're going to constrain is the up and down movement of our piston head. We need to constrain it to something, so select our rod, because if we constrain it to the rod, the piston head is going to jump up here to the rod axis and it will be constrained there. We need to constrain it to the end here, so I'm going to hold down shift with the rod selected and add in a null, which will add it as a child. Then I'm going to zero out the parameters, so that null is at the axis of our rod, and let's just pull this down. Okay, so we could put it here, in which case when we constrain our position to that, it's going to jump up so that the axis of it matches it, so it's going to jump up to somewhere around there. So let's just rename this piston head target. Select the position constraint that we have on our piston head and let's drag that piston head target into there. As soon as we let go, you can see it jumps up, as I said. There is an option in here to maintain original, which you can check, which will maintain the original position and it will add that offset. But let's just uncheck that to keep it nice and simple. Now we've set that up, if we move that piston head target, then our piston head will follow. So we should be able to just grab our camshaft, come over to the coordinates and adjust the rotation, and you can see now that as we rotate around, it is indeed working. Now of course it isn't exactly how piston would work, but it generally is, and it gives you a good idea of how you can work with the hierarchy of objects and also with constraints to make some very simple rigs, and animating this by keyframing everything would be absolutely nightmarish, and just by building little simple rigs like this can make your life so much easier. And I guess the only thing we really need to do with this now is to add in a null object, and we can call this piston, and let's just grab all of our elements and drag them into this piston, so now we can actually take the whole thing and move it around and position it wherever we want. But other than that, that's the basic piston or the simple piston rig built. Let's reset that to 0 and we can save this one out and move on to the next tutorial. Thanks.